Good evening. Tonight we examine three darkest cases from history. The first one of the darkest chapters in Victorian England's hidden domestic crimes. A woman paid to care for infants. A child was found dead by the roadside. A courtroom gripped by horror. And a sentence that should have ended at the gallows, but did not. Her name was Charlotte Winsor. She was known as a baby farmer, a woman who took in unwanted infants for a fee. Her trial shocked the nation. Her survival of execution raised suspicion, and her case helped change British law forever. This is the story of Charlotte Winsor and the scandal that exposed the lethal underside of Victorian childcare. To understand Charlotte Winsor, we must first understand Victorian England. By the mid-19th century, industrial cities were growing rapidly. Poverty was widespread, and social shame was unforgiving. Unmarried mothers faced ruin. With few legal protections, many women turned to a quiet arrangement, paying someone else to take their infant away. This practice became known as baby farming. In theory, baby farmers cared for children. In practice, many infants died from neglect, starvation, or deliberate harm. There was little oversight, no regulation, and no reliable records. It was a system ripe for abuse, and Charlotte Winsor operated within it. Who was Charlotte Winsor? Charlotte Winsor was an English woman operating in the early 1860s. She presented herself as a caretaker, someone willing to relieve desperate mothers of unwanted children. For a fee, she promised discretion, care, and safety. What mothers did not know, or feared to question, was what truly happened after the handover. By 1865, Charlotte Winsor had drawn the attention of authorities, and it would be the death of one child that brought her into the public eye, the infant, Thomas Edwin Gibson Harris. The case centered on an infant named Thomas Edwin Gibson Harris. His mother, Mary Jane Harris, placed the child into Windsor's care. She paid her. She trusted her. Not long after the infant disappeared, then came the discovery. The body of a baby was found by the roadside near Torquay. The condition of the remains suggested neglect and worse. The investigation moved quickly. Suspicion fell on Charlotte Winsor. Arrest and investigation. Winsor was arrested in 1865. Authorities examined her movements, her arrangements with mothers, and her handling of infants. Mary Jane Harris became a key witness. Her testimony would prove crucial. This was no longer just a tragic death. It was evidence of a system and a person that treated infants as disposable. Public interest grew rapidly, and so did outrage. The trial. A nation watches. Charlotte Winsor stood trial for murder. The courtroom was packed. Newspapers followed every detail. Prosecutors argued that Winsor had intentionally caused the infant's death. The defense attempted to create doubt, suggesting accident, illness, or circumstance, but the jury was unmoved. Charlotte Winsor was found guilty. The sentence was clear: death by hanging. Victorian England believed justice had finally caught a baby farmer. But the story did not end there. The commutation, a life spared. In a stunning turn, Charlotte Winsor did not go to the gallows. A legal technicality, not innocence, intervened. Her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Why? Records suggest flaws in the indictment and procedural concerns. To the public, it felt like justice interrupted. A woman convicted of murdering a child would live, and she would live a long time. Life in prison and death. Charlotte Winsor served nearly 30 years in prison. She aged behind bars. She faded from headlines. She eventually died of old age, not execution. For many Victorians, this outcome felt deeply unsettling. A child was dead, but the punishment felt incomplete. Windsor's case, along with that of Margaret Waters in 1870, sparked national outrage. The public demanded action. The result was the Infant Life Protection Act of 1872, the first British law regulating paid infant care. For the first time, baby farming faced legal oversight. Charlotte Windsor's crime had helped expose a national failure. Windsor's notoriety was such that she was immortalized in Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors. A full-length wax model, taken from life, was displayed for public viewing. Her name became synonymous with danger, secrecy, and infant death. Her case has also been linked indirectly to another Devon mystery, John Babbacombe Lee, the man they could not hang. Shared lawyers, possible family connections, patterns Victorian justice never fully explained. How many children passed through Charlotte Windsor's care? How many died unseen, unrecorded, and unnamed? Was Thomas Harris her only victim, or simply the one discovered? Why did the law fail to intervene sooner? And did Windsor escape full justice because of legal error or systemic reluctance to confront domestic crimes committed by women? Charlotte Windsor died quietly, but the infants did not. Tonight, her story remains a warning from the Victorian past that crimes committed behind closed doors are often the hardest to uncover and the easiest to ignore. Now we examine second case and one of the most infamous murder cases in early American history. A wealthy sea captain killed in his sleep, a family driven by inheritance, a conspiracy built on greed and secrecy, and a trial so powerful that its closing arguments are still taught in law schools today. At the center of it all was a man named Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. This is the story of ambition, betrayal, and a crime that helped shape the American legal system itself. To understand this case, we must return to Salem, Massachusetts, in the year 1830. Salem was no longer the witch trial town of the 17th century, but it remained a place where reputation mattered deeply. It was a close-knit society. Family connections defined wealth, inheritance defined power, property passed through wills, and wills once written could determine the fate of generations. At the top of this particular family tree stood Captain Joseph White. Captain Joseph White was a wealthy and elderly man, a respected figure in Salem, a man with no children of his own. His fortune was substantial, and his will, or rumored will, was the subject of quiet speculation. Among those watching closely was his extended family, including the family of Joseph Knapp, Jr. Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. was born in 1803. He was married into Captain White's family. Not close enough to inherit directly, but close enough to benefit if the will disappeared. Knapp was ambitious, impatient, and convinced that Captain White's estate stood between him and financial security. Prosecutors would later argue that Knapp believed two things. First, that Captain White's will excluded his branch of the family. Second, that if the will were destroyed and White were dead, the estate would be divided among surviving relatives, including Knapp's own household. It was a theory built on greed, and it would lead to murder. Joseph Knapp, Jr. was not alone. He enlisted his brother, John Francis Knapp. Together they planned a crime designed to look like a robbery. They would not strike themselves. Instead, they hired a man with a violent reputation. His name was Richard Crowninshield. Crowninshield was known to be unstable, a man capable of killing and unlikely to talk afterward. The plan was simple. Enter Captain White's home at night, kill him quietly, leave minimal evidence, and allow the will to vanish. On the night of April 6, 1830, Richard Crowninshield entered the Gardner-Pingree house. Captain White was asleep. There was no struggle. White was murdered in his bed. Outside, Joseph Knapp, Jr. and John Francis Knapp acted as lookouts. The crime was swift, but its aftermath would not be. Salem awoke to shock. A wealthy, respected man had been murdered inside his own home, and the killer was still free. Authorities immediately suspected that this was not a random act. There were no signs of theft. Nothing of value had been taken. Attention turned to motive. Who stood to gain from Captain White's death? The investigation moved quietly, but steadily. Then something unexpected happened. Joseph Knapp, Jr. received a letter. The blackmail letter. The letter was written by John Palmer using the alias Charles Grant. It was a blackmail note. Palmer demanded money, suggesting he knew details about the murder. Joseph Knapp, Jr. made a critical mistake. Instead of destroying the letter, he tried to ignore it, but investigators found it, and the letter became the thread that unraveled the entire conspiracy. Suspicion turned sharply toward the Knapp brothers. Arrests and collapse. Richard Crowninshield, was arrested. Before he could stand trial, he committed suicide in his jail cell. With the hired killer dead, attention focused entirely on the planners. Joseph Knapp Jr. and John Francis Knapp were arrested. The case moved to trial, and the nation watched. The prosecution was led by Daniel Webster. His closing arguments were precise, forceful, and unforgettable. Webster did not rely on emotion alone. He reconstructed the conspiracy step by step. He showed motive, opportunity, and intent. The jury was convinced. Both Joseph Knapp Jr. and John Francis Knapp were found guilty of murder. The sentence was unavoidable. Death. On December 31, 1830, Joseph Knapp Jr. was hanged in Salem. His brother would follow. There was no confession that resolved every question, no final revelation. The case ended not with clarity, but with punishment. Did Joseph Knapp Jr. truly believe the will would disappear? Were there other conspirators who were never named? Was greed the only motive, or did resentment and entitlement play a deeper role? History records the verdict, but intention is harder to hang. The Knapp murder case became a landmark, not just for its brutality, but for how American justice learned to prosecute conspiracy itself. Tonight, it remains a reminder that some crimes are committed not in passion, but in calculation. And calculation leaves behind questions that execution can never answer. For third case, we travel to colonial Australia, to a mining town built on hope, hardship, and sudden wealth. A young woman is found dead in her home. A man is accused, tried, and executed, and years later, serious doubts emerge about whether justice was ever served. This is not simply a murder story. It is a story about fragile evidence, public pressure, and a legal system struggling to find truth in a frontier society. Tonight, we investigate the Daylesford tragedy and the unresolved case surrounding Margaret Graham. By the 1860s, the colony of Victoria, Australia, was transformed by gold. Mining towns sprang up almost overnight. Among them was Daylesford, a settlement defined by opportunity and instability. Populations were transient. Law enforcement was limited. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Violence was not uncommon, but murder, especially inside the home, still shocked the public. It was in this volatile environment that Margaret Graham lived, and where she would die. Margaret Graham was a young woman, recently married, living what appeared to be a modest domestic life. She was not wealthy, not politically connected, and not widely known outside her community. Her life left little historical record. What survives of Margaret Graham comes almost entirely from court documents and newspaper reports written after her death. She would become remembered not for how she lived, but for how her case unfolded. On December 28, 1864, Margaret Graham was found dead inside her home in Daylesford. The circumstances were immediately troubling. This was not a public crime. No witnesses came forward. No clear motive was obvious. The scene offered more questions than answers. Was it robbery, personal violence, or something more deliberate? The colony demanded answers, and quickly, attention turned to finding a suspect. In early 1865, authorities arrested a man named David Young. Young maintained his innocence from the beginning. There was no clear physical evidence linking him directly to the murder. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial claims, timing, and inference. Young's defense counsel described the case against him as flimsy. But in colonial Victoria, public fear often outweighed legal caution. A conviction was expected. David Young's trial moved swiftly. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Newspapers fueled speculation. Public opinion hardened early. The jury was asked to decide guilt without modern forensic tools, without clear eyewitness testimony, and without a definitive motive. Despite these weaknesses, David Young was found guilty. The sentence was severe: death. There would be no appeal that saved him, no delay that uncovered new facts. The law moved forward. David Young was executed. With his death, the case was officially closed. Margaret Graham's murder had been answered, at least on paper. But beneath the surface, unease remained. Even at the time, some questioned whether the right man had been punished. Yet the machinery of justice had already finished its work. In 1873, nearly a decade after the execution, new reports surfaced. They suggested that another man, Antonio Silvestro, may have been involved in Margaret Graham's death. Details were vague. Evidence was incomplete, but the implication was explosive. If true, David Young may have been innocent. By then it was too late. The grave does not hear appeals. The Daylesford tragedy became one of colonial Australia's most troubling legal stories, not because it was unsolved, but because it may have been wrongly solved. Margaret Graham remained a victim, but David Young may have become another. The legal system offered no formal reckoning, no posthumous inquiry, no official admission of error. History moved on, but doubt did not. Who killed Margaret Graham? Was justice served? Or merely concluded? Did public pressure demand a conviction more than evidence demanded truth? And how many frontier cases were decided the same way? Swiftly, quietly, and permanently? Margaret Graham's death remains officially resolved. But the execution of David Young casts a long shadow. Tonight, the Daylesford tragedy reminds us that history does not always reveal innocence. Sometimes it only reveals doubt. Good evening.